What if one morning you woke up and California was no longer part of the United States? No Hollywood jokes, no social media memes. A real political, economic, and global shockwave. California is the most populous state in the US, home to nearly 40 million people. And if it were a country, it would rank among the top 5 largest economies in the world. So when people ask, what happens if California secedes from the United States? That question isn't just hypothetical, it's massive. In this video, we're not arguing whether California should leave the US, we're asking a simpler, but far more important question. What would actually happen if it tried? First things first, is secession even legal? Short answer, no. At least not under current US law. The US Supreme Court settled this question back in 1869, after the Civil War, in a case called Texas v. White. The court ruled that the United States is an indestructible union, meaning states do not have the legal right to leave on their own. So unlike Brexit, where the UK had a legal exit process, there is no constitutional mechanism for a US state to secede. For California to leave legally, one of two extreme things would have to happen. 1. A constitutional amendment approved by 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. 2. A political revolution or breakdown of federal authority. Both scenarios are historically rare and politically explosive. So if California voted to secede tomorrow, Washington wouldn't say good luck, it would say, that vote has no legal standing. What if California tried anyway? Let's say California held a statewide referendum and voters overwhelmingly chose independence. That vote alone wouldn't make California a country, but it would create a constitutional crisis. Here's what would likely follow. The federal government would challenge the move in court. Federal agencies would remain in California. US military bases would stay under US control. Federal taxes would still be owed. California's representatives would technically still be members of Congress. At that point, the conflict wouldn't be about borders. It would be about authority. Who controls the ports? Who enforces immigration laws? Who owns federal land, which makes up nearly half of California's territory? These questions wouldn't be settled by slogans. They'd be settled by courts, negotiations, and possibly force. The economic earthquake. Now let's talk money, because this is where things get serious. California's economy is worth over $3.5 trillion, larger than most nations on Earth. It dominates industries like technology, entertainment, agriculture, aerospace, international trade. But here's the catch. California's economy is deeply intertwined with the rest of the United States. If California seceded, interstate commerce would become international trade. Tariffs could be imposed on goods crossing borders. Supply chains would be disrupted overnight. The US dollar might no longer be California's currency. California would have to decide, do we create a new currency? Do we keep using the US dollar without control over it? Do we try to peg to another global currency? Any of those options would come with instability, inflation risks, and market panic. At least in the short term. Wall Street wouldn't wait to see how it turns out. Markets hate uncertainty. What about everyday Californians? This wouldn't just be a story about politicians. It would affect real people immediately. Questions millions of Californians would face. Are we still US citizens? Do Social Security and Medicare still apply? What happens to military veterans? Can we freely travel to the rest of the US? Do we need passports to cross state lines? For many families, especially those with relatives in other states, independence wouldn't feel empowering. It would feel disruptive and personal. And that's before we even talk about housing, healthcare, and immigration. The US perspective. From Washington's point of view, California leaving wouldn't just be losing a state. It would be losing a major tax contributor, critical ports on the Pacific, strategic military locations, global economic influence. The US wouldn't just shrug this off. It would be the biggest political crisis since the Civil War. Without exaggeration. So legally, politically, and economically, California seceding from the US would be anything but simple. But here's the bigger question. What would happen next? Internationally, militarily, and socially. If California actually became its own country. If California somehow crossed every legal and political barrier and became an independent country, the shock wouldn't stop at America's borders. It would ripple across the world. Because at that point, California wouldn't just be a former US state. It would instantly become one of the most powerful new nations in modern history. How would the world react? The first question foreign governments would ask isn't, is California cool? It's, does Washington recognize it? International recognition is everything. Most US allies, NATO countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, would likely refuse to recognize California unless the US government formally agreed to the separation. Why? Because recognizing a breakaway region without consent sets a dangerous precedent. Spain worries about Catalonia. China worries about Taiwan. Russia worries about its own regions. So without US approval, California could find itself diplomatically isolated at first, rich, influential, but legally in limbo. Countries that might recognize California early would likely do so for strategic reasons. Expanded access to Pacific trade routes, tech partnerships, reduced dependence on Washington. But make no mistake, global recognition would be slow, cautious, and political. The military question no one can avoid. Now we get to the most uncomfortable part of this scenario, the military. California is home to major U.S. Navy bases, Air Force installations, Space Force assets, defense contractors, nuclear-capable infrastructure nearby. If California became independent, none of those assets would automatically belong to the new country. Under international law, U.S. military bases would remain U.S. property, unless formally transferred. That would require treaties, compensation, and congressional approval. So California would face a stark reality. No standing national military. No nuclear deterrent. No formal defense alliances. No guaranteed protection. Building a military from scratch isn't just expensive, it's slow. And during that transition, California would rely heavily on diplomacy, not force. Ironically, California's biggest security concern wouldn't be foreign invasion. It would be internal stability and its relationship with the United States. Borders, immigration, and trade overnight. An independent California would instantly have an international border with the United States, responsibility for ports of entry, full control over immigration policy. But here's the problem. Millions of people cross the California U.S. border every day for work, family, and commerce. Would Americans need visas to enter California? Would Californians need passports to visit Nevada or Arizona? Even a soft border agreement would take years to negotiate. In the meantime, trade could slow dramatically. Border communities would be hit hardest. Prices for goods could rise quickly. California imports huge amounts of water, electricity, and food inputs from other states. Independence wouldn't eliminate that dependence. It would relabel it as foreign trade. Can California survive economically? Here's the honest answer. Yes, but not easily. California has a massive tax base, global brands, world-leading universities, innovation ecosystems. But it also has one of the highest costs of living in the world, enormous infrastructure expenses, housing shortages, income inequality. As an independent country, California would need to fund its own military, its own border security, its own currency system, its own social safety nets. Without federal support, those costs land entirely on Californians. Taxes would almost certainly rise, at least initially. Over time, California could stabilize and thrive, especially if it maintains strong trade ties with the U.S. But the transition would be painful, uncertain, politically divisive. What happens to the United States without California? For the U.S., losing California wouldn't mean collapse, but it would hurt. The U.S. would lose a major source of tax revenue, Pacific trade dominance, cultural and technological influence. Politically, the balance of power would shift dramatically, fewer Democratic electoral votes, different congressional makeup, long-term changes to national identity. America would still be a superpower, but a diminished one. And psychologically, the idea that a state could leave would change the country forever. The bigger truth. Here's the conclusion most people don't expect. California seceding wouldn't be a clean breakup. It would be a long, chaotic negotiation that could last decades. Both sides would lose something. Both sides would adapt. And everyday people, not politicians, would bear most of the cost. That's why, despite the lines and slogans, secession movements remain symbolic rather than realistic. So what happens if California secedes from the United States? Legally, almost impossible. Economically, massive disruption. Politically, a global shock. Humanly, deeply complicated. It's a fascinating idea. But reality is far messier than imagination. Some questions don't have simple answers. But what do you think? Is this the truth, or just the beginning? Subscribe to Era X to explore more. Until next time, welcome to a new era.